Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates were playing with dolls, she was climbing trees and wrestling with the neighborhood boys. Her father, a Marine veteran, taught her to fight, swim, and never back down from a challenge. When Sarah turned 18, she shocked everyone by joining the Navy. The decision didn't come easily. Sarah's mother cried for weeks, begging her daughter to choose a safer path. Her teachers suggested college instead of military service. Even her father, despite his pride, worried about the dangers his daughter would face. But Sarah's mind was made up. She had always felt called to serve her country and protect others. Basic training was brutal, but Sarah thrived. She outran many of her male counterparts, excelled in combat training, and showed natural leadership skills. Her drill instructors noticed her potential immediately. They pushed her harder than the others, knowing she could handle it. While other recruits complained about the harsh conditions, Sarah embraced every challenge. After graduating at the top of her class, Sarah applied for the most elite program the Navy offered: SEAL training. The application process alone was intimidating. Only the strongest, smartest, and most determined sailors were even considered. When Sarah submitted her paperwork, several officers laughed. A female Navy SEAL? It seemed impossible. The odds were stacked against her from the beginning. No woman had ever successfully completed SEAL training. The physical requirements were designed for men, and the mental challenges were meant to break even the toughest soldiers. Many believed that women simply weren't built for such demanding work. Sarah knew she would have to prove herself every single day. Her first day at SEAL training was a wake-up call. The other candidates, all men, looked at her with skepticism and doubt. Some whispered that she was only there to fill a quota. Others made cruel jokes about her chances of survival. The instructors weren't much better, treating her like a curiosity rather than a serious candidate. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Sarah's life. She woke up at 4 a.m. for grueling physical training sessions. She carried heavy equipment across miles of sand, swam in freezing ocean water, and endured sleep deprivation that would break most people. Many of her fellow candidates dropped out, unable to handle the pressure, but Sarah persisted. When others complained about the cold, she stayed silent and pushed through. When instructors screamed in her face, she maintained her composure. When her body screamed for rest, she found the strength to continue. Slowly, grudgingly, she began to earn the respect of her peers and trainers. The real test came during Hell Week, the most notorious part of SEAL training. For 5.5 days, candidates were pushed to their absolute limits. They slept less than 4 hours total, ran hundreds of miles, and performed impossible tasks while being constantly berated by instructors. It was designed to weed out anyone who didn't have the mental toughness required for special operations. Sarah's body was failing by the 3rd day. Her hands were raw and bleeding, her legs felt like concrete, and exhaustion clouded her judgment. Several times, she considered ringing the bell that would end her training. It would be so easy to quit, to walk away from the pain and humiliation. But each time, she thought about her father's lessons and pushed forward. On the final day of Hell Week, only 12 candidates remained from the original class of 48. Sarah was among them. Battered but unbroken, the instructors gathered the survivors and looked each one in the eye. When they reached Sarah, the senior instructor paused. For a moment, his stern expression softened with something that might have been respect. The months that followed brought new challenges. Sarah learned advanced combat techniques, underwater demolition, parachuting, and weapons training. She studied foreign languages, medical procedures, and military strategy. Each phase of training eliminated more candidates, but Sarah continued to excel. Her fellow trainees began to see her differently. The jokes stopped, replaced by genuine camaraderie. They realized that Sarah wasn't there because of any special treatment or lowered standards. She was there because she belonged. Her determination and skill spoke louder than any doubts about her gender. The instructors, too, began to treat her as an equal. They still pushed her hard, perhaps even harder than the others. But it came from a place of professional respect rather than skepticism. They saw her potential and wanted to help her reach it. Sarah appreciated their honesty, even when it was brutal. As graduation approached, Sarah reflected on her journey. She had lost 20 pounds, gained countless scars, and pushed her body and mind beyond what she thought possible. She had proven that determination could overcome prejudice, that strength came in many forms, and that breaking barriers required more than just talent. It required unshakable resolve. The night before graduation, Sarah called her parents. Her father's voice was thick with emotion as he told her how proud he was. Her mother, who had opposed the military path from the beginning, admitted that she was amazed by her daughter's strength. They would both be there to watch her receive the coveted SEAL Trident. Graduation day was bittersweet. Only 8 candidates from the original class remained. They stood in perfect formation as the commanding officer delivered his speech about honor, sacrifice, and brotherhood. When he called Sarah's name and pinned the trident to her uniform, she felt a surge of pride that made all the pain worthwhile. But even as she celebrated this historic achievement, Sarah knew that the real challenges lay ahead. Training was over. Now came the test of actual operations. She would soon be deployed with a team of seasoned SEALs, where her skills would be put to the ultimate test. The question wasn't whether she could complete the training anymore. It was whether she could prove herself worthy of the trust her teammates would place in her when their lives were on the line. Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates were playing with dolls, she was climbing trees and wrestling with the neighborhood boys. Her father, a Marine veteran, taught her to fight, swim, and never back down from a challenge. When Sarah turned 18, she shocked everyone by joining the Navy. The decision didn't come easily. Sarah's mother cried for weeks, begging her daughter to choose a safer path. Her teachers suggested college instead of military service. Even her father, despite his pride, worried about the dangers his daughter would face. But Sarah's mind was made up. She had always felt called to serve her country and protect others. Basic training was brutal, but Sarah thrived. She outran many of her male counterparts, excelled in combat training, and showed natural leadership skills. Her drill instructors noticed her potential immediately. They pushed her harder than the others, knowing she could handle it. While other recruits complained about the harsh conditions, Sarah embraced every challenge. After graduating at the top of her class, Sarah applied for the most elite program the Navy offered: SEAL training. The application process alone was intimidating. Only the strongest, smartest, and most determined sailors were even considered. When Sarah submitted her paperwork, several officers laughed. A female Navy SEAL? It seemed impossible. The odds were stacked against her from the beginning. No woman had ever successfully completed SEAL training. The physical requirements were designed for men, and the mental challenges were meant to break even the toughest soldiers. Many believed that women simply weren't built for such demanding work. Sarah knew she would have to prove herself every single day. Her first day at SEAL training was a wake-up call. The other candidates, all men, looked at her with skepticism and doubt. Some whispered that she was only there to fill a quota. Others made cruel jokes about her chances of survival. The instructors weren't much better, treating her like a curiosity rather than a serious candidate. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Sarah's life. She woke up at 4 a.m. for grueling physical training sessions. She carried heavy equipment across miles of sand, swam in freezing ocean water, and endured sleep deprivation that would break most people. Many of her fellow candidates dropped out, unable to handle the pressure, but Sarah persisted. When others complained about the cold, she stayed silent and pushed through. When instructors screamed in her face, she maintained her composure. When her body screamed for rest, she found the strength to continue. Slowly, grudgingly, she began to earn the respect of her peers and trainers. The real test came during Hell Week, the most notorious part of SEAL training. For 5.5 days, candidates were pushed to their absolute limits. They slept less than 4 hours total, ran hundreds of miles, and performed impossible tasks while being constantly berated by instructors. It was designed to weed out anyone who didn't have the mental toughness required for special operations. Sarah's body was failing by the 3rd day. Her hands were raw and bleeding, Her legs felt like concrete, and exhaustion clouded her judgment. Several times, she considered ringing the bell that would end her training. It would be so easy to quit, to walk away from the pain and humiliation, but each time, she thought about her father's lessons and pushed forward. On the final day of Hell Week, only 12 candidates remained from the original class of 48. Sarah was among them. Battered, but unbroken, the instructors gathered the survivors and looked each one in the eye. When they reached Sarah, the senior instructor paused. For a moment, his stern expression softened with something that might have been respect. The months that followed brought new challenges. Sarah learned advanced combat techniques, underwater demolition, parachuting, and weapons training. She studied foreign languages, medical procedures, and military strategy. Each phase of training eliminated more candidates, but Sarah continued to excel. Her fellow trainees began to see her differently. The jokes stopped, replaced by genuine camaraderie. They realized that Sarah wasn't there because of any special treatment or lowered standards. She was there because she belonged. Her determination and skills spoke louder than any doubts about her gender. The instructors, too, began to treat her as an equal. They still pushed her hard, perhaps even harder than the others. But it came from a place of professional respect rather than skepticism. They saw her potential and wanted to help her reach it. Sarah appreciated their honesty, even when it was brutal. As graduation approached, Sarah reflected on her journey. She had lost 20 pounds, gained countless scars, and pushed her body and mind beyond what she thought possible. She had proven that determination could overcome prejudice, that strength came in many forms, and that breaking barriers required more than just talent. It required unshakable resolve. The night before graduation, Sarah called her parents. Her father's voice was thick with emotion as he told her how proud he was. Her mother, who had opposed the military path from the beginning, admitted that she was amazed by her daughter's strength. They would both be there to watch her receive the coveted seal trident. Graduation day was bittersweet. Only 8 candidates from the original class remained. They stood in perfect formation as the commanding officer delivered his speech about honor, sacrifice, and brotherhood. When he called Sarah's name and pinned the trident to her uniform, she felt a surge of pride that made all the pain worthwhile. But even as she celebrated this historic achievement, Sarah knew that the real challenges lay ahead. Training was over. Now came the test of actual operations. She would soon be deployed with a team of seasoned SEALs, where her skills would be put to the ultimate test. The question wasn't whether she could complete the training anymore. It was whether she could prove herself worthy of the trust her teammates would place in her when their lives were on the line. 3 months after their successful reconnaissance mission, SEAL Team 4 received orders for a high-priority hostage rescue operation. American aid workers had been kidnapped by terrorists in a remote region of Africa, and intelligence indicated they were being held in a fortified compound deep in hostile territory. The mission would be their most dangerous yet, requiring precision, courage, and flawless teamwork. The briefing took place in a secure conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command. Intelligence officers laid out satellite images, floor plans, and detailed information about the terrorist group holding the hostages. The enemy was well armed and experienced, having successfully evaded capture for months. They had chosen their stronghold carefully. A converted monastery, surrounded by high walls and difficult terrain. Sarah studied every detail of the mission plan. The compound sat atop a hill overlooking a valley, with only one road leading to the main gate. The terrorists had established overlapping fields of fire and positioned heavy weapons at key points. Getting inside would require scaling the walls under cover of darkness, neutralizing sentries silently, and reaching the hostages before the alarm could be raised. Commander Morrison assigned roles based on each team member's strengths. Mike would handle explosives and breaching. Tom would provide sniper support from a distant ridgeline. Danny would secure their extraction route, and Sarah would be responsible for locating and protecting the hostages once they were inside the compound. It was a crucial assignment that demonstrated Morrison's growing confidence in her abilities. The team spent 2 weeks preparing for the mission. They built a replica of the target compound at their training facility, and rehearsed the operation until every movement became instinctive. Sarah practiced moving through the building layout in complete darkness, memorizing the location of every room and corridor. She also received additional medical training to treat wounded hostages if necessary. During one training session, a concerning issue emerged. The narrow passages inside the converted monastery would force the team to move in single file through several sections. Standard protocol called for the largest team members to lead, using their physical presence to intimidate and control any threats they encountered. However, the building's layout favored smaller, more agile operators who could move quickly through tight spaces. Some team members questioned whether Sarah should take point during certain phases of the operation. Her smaller frame was an advantage in the confined spaces, but leading the team into danger was traditionally reserved for the most experienced operators. The debate created tension within the group, with some arguing that Sarah wasn't ready for such responsibility despite her proven skills. Commander Morrison made the final decision based on tactical considerations rather than politics. Sarah would take point through the narrow corridors because she was best suited for the job. If they encountered resistance in those areas, her speed and agility would give the team the best chance of success. It was a vote of confidence that meant everything to Sarah, even as it increased the pressure on her shoulders. The team deployed to Africa on an unmarked transport aircraft, flying through the night to avoid detection. They landed at a remote airstrip and transferred to local vehicles that would take them within striking distance of the target. The final approach would be made on foot, through difficult terrain that offered concealment but tested their endurance. As they moved through the African wilderness, Sarah felt the weight of her equipment and the gravity of their mission. 3 innocent Americans were counting on them for rescue, and failure could mean torture and death for the hostages. The terrorists had already demonstrated their brutality, releasing videos that showed the deplorable conditions in which the aid workers were being held. The team established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the compound and spent 6 hours studying guard routines and identifying weaknesses in the perimeter security. Sarah used this time to visualize their route through the building, planning for various contingencies. She knew that once they went over the wall, there would be no time for hesitation or second-guessing. As darkness fell, the team began their final approach. They moved like shadows across the rocky terrain, using natural cover to avoid detection. Tom positioned himself at the sniper hide site while the others crept toward the compound walls. The night was moonless, providing excellent concealment, but making navigation more challenging. The first obstacle was a 12-foot stone wall, topped with razor wire. Mike used specialized equipment to create a silent breach, carefully cutting through the wire and establishing anchor points for their climbing ropes. One by one, the team scaled the wall and dropped into the compound courtyard. Sarah's heart pounded as her feet touched enemy territory for the first time. The courtyard was larger than expected, with several outbuildings that weren't visible in the satellite imagery. This complicated their approach to the main building, forcing them to alter their planned route on the fly. Commander Morrison made hand signals indicating the new path, and the team adjusted smoothly to the changed circumstances. They encountered their first sentry near the main entrance. The guard was smoking a cigarette and appeared relaxed. Unaware of the danger approaching from the shadows, Mike moved forward with practiced stealth and neutralized the threat silently. The man dropped without making a sound, but his absence would eventually be noticed during the next guard change. Inside the building, the team split up according to plan. Sarah took point through a narrow service corridor that led toward the area where intelligence suggested the hostages were being held. The passage was even tighter than expected, barely wide enough for her shoulders. Behind her, she could hear the other team members struggling to squeeze through the confined space. The corridor opened into a larger room filled with old furniture and religious artifacts left over from the building's days as a monastery. Sarah paused to listen for any sounds that might indicate enemy presence. The building was eerily quiet, except for the distant sound of voices from somewhere deeper inside. They were getting close to their objective. As they moved deeper into the complex, Sarah's training took over completely. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound could be a warning of approaching danger. She moved with fluid precision, checking corners and maintaining awareness of her teammates' positions. The months of preparation were paying off, as muscle memory guided her actions. Then they heard it. the sound of American voices speaking softly in English. The hostages were nearby, probably just beyond the next corridor. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized they were about to complete the most important phase of their mission, but she also knew that the most dangerous moments lay ahead, as they would need to secure the hostages and fight their way back to the extraction point. Sarah approached the heavy wooden door where the American voices were coming from. Through a small gap at the bottom, she could see dim light and shadows moving inside. Commander Morrison positioned himself beside her while Mike and Danny secured the corridor behind them. This was the moment they had trained for. The rescue itself would determine whether their mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. Morrison held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. On his signal, Sarah pushed the door open and swept into the room with her weapon ready. Inside, she found 3 Americans huddled in the corner, 2 men and 1 woman, all showing signs of mistreatment, but alive and conscious. Their faces showed a mixture of fear and desperate hope as they realized their rescuers had arrived. The woman, Dr. Jennifer Hayes, was a medical volunteer who had been providing aid to local villages. The 2 men, Robert Kim and David Turner, were engineers working on a water purification project. All 3 had been captured 2 weeks earlier while traveling between villages. They looked exhausted and malnourished, but appeared capable of moving under their own power. Sarah quickly checked each hostage for injuries, while Morrison secured the room. Dr. Hayes had a badly bruised face and favored her left arm, but insisted she could walk. The engineers were in better physical condition, though clearly shaken by their ordeal. All 3 were dehydrated and would need assistance during the extraction, but none required immediate medical intervention. As Sarah helped the hostages to their feet, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. The guard rotation was starting earlier than expected, which meant their window for escape was rapidly closing. Morrison made quick hand signals indicating they needed to move immediately. The team would have to fight their way out, rather than slip away undetected as originally planned. The extraction route took them through the main corridor of the building, where they encountered their first serious resistance. 2 armed terrorists rounded the corner just as Sarah was helping Dr. Hayes navigate a pile of debris. The enemies opened fire immediately, forcing the team to take cover behind stone pillars that offered minimal protection from automatic weapons. Mike returned fire while Morrison coordinated the team's response. Sarah found herself shielding Dr. Hayes with her own body as bullets chipped stone fragments from the walls around them. The noise was deafening in the confined space, and the muzzle flashes created a strobe light effect that made it difficult to track enemy movements accurately. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes but felt like hours. When the shooting stopped, both terrorists were down, and the team was intact. Though Danny had taken a grazing wound to his shoulder, Sarah quickly applied a field dressing to stop the bleeding, while Morrison checked their escape route. More enemies would be arriving soon, drawn by the sounds of combat. Moving through the building with 3 civilians proved more challenging than anticipated. The hostages were weak from their captivity and struggled to keep up with the team's rapid pace. Sarah found herself constantly looking back to ensure they weren't falling behind, while simultaneously watching for threats ahead. The responsibility of protecting helpless people added a new dimension to the stress of combat. They reached the main entrance to find their exit blocked by 4 terrorists who had taken defensive positions behind overturned furniture. The enemy had automatic rifles and grenades, turning the lobby into a kill zone that would be suicide to cross. Tom's sniper support couldn't help them inside the building, leaving the team to handle the situation with their own resources. Morrison made a quick tactical decision. Mike would create a diversion with flashbang grenades, while Sarah led the hostages through a side passage that connected to the building's original chapel. It was a longer route but avoided the heavily defended main lobby. The plan required precise timing and absolute trust between team members. The side passage was narrow and cluttered with religious artifacts that made movement difficult. Sarah had to physically support Dr. Hayes, whose injured arm made climbing over obstacles nearly impossible. Behind them, they could hear the explosion of Mike's grenades followed by intense gunfire as the team engaged the lobby defenders. The chapel turned out to be a trap. As Sarah emerged from the passage with the hostages, she found herself facing 2 more terrorists who had anticipated their alternative route. The enemies had positioned themselves behind the altar, giving them clear fields of fire across the entire chapel. Sarah had seconds to react before they would cut down the helpless civilians. Training and instinct took over. Sarah pushed the hostages behind a marble column while simultaneously drawing her sidearm. She engaged both targets with precise shots that dropped them before they could fire at the Americans. The action happened so quickly that the hostages barely understood what had occurred until they saw the bodies of their would-be killers. "Stay close to me and do exactly what I say," Sarah told the hostages as she reloaded her weapon. Dr. Hayes nodded with newfound respect in her eyes. She had initially been surprised to see a female soldier leading their rescue, but Sarah's competence under fire had eliminated any doubts about her capabilities. The team regrouped in the chapel and prepared for the final push to their extraction point. They could hear vehicles approaching the compound as terrorist reinforcements arrived to deal with the attack. Morrison estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before being completely surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces. The chapel had a side exit that led directly to the compound's outer wall, avoiding the courtyard where enemies were now gathering. Sarah helped the hostages through the door while Mike and Danny provided covering fire from defensive positions near the altar. The familiar sound of Tom's sniper rifle echoed across the compound as he engaged targets from his distant hide site. Outside, they faced their most dangerous challenge yet. The area between the chapel and the wall was open ground, with no cover, making them vulnerable to fire from multiple directions. Worse, the terrorists had positioned a heavy machine gun on the roof of a nearby building, commanding a perfect view of their escape route. Morrison called for immediate air support, but the nearest friendly aircraft was still 20 minutes away. They would have to cross the kill zone using speed, smoke grenades, and desperate courage. Sarah looked at the 3 frightened Americans who depended on her for their lives and made a silent promise that she would get them home safely. The machine gun opened fire as they broke cover, sending streams of tracer rounds across their path. Sarah grabbed Dr. Hayes and sprinted toward the wall, while Morrison and the others laid down suppressing fire. Bullets whined overhead and kicked up dirt around their feet as they ran the longest 50 meters of their lives. They reached the wall just as their covering fire ran out of ammunition. Mike had already prepared the breach point, but climbing over with injured and exhausted civilians would take precious time they didn't have. The machine gun was adjusting its aim toward their position, and more terrorists were moving to cut off their retreat. The machine gun's deadly chatter grew closer as Sarah helped boost Dr. Hayes over the compound wall. The woman's injured arm made climbing nearly impossible, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind them, Morrison and Danny were running low on ammunition as more terrorists poured into the courtyard. Just as Sarah was helping the second hostage over the wall, disaster struck. A grenade explosion near the chapel sent shrapnel flying across the compound. Danny cried out and collapsed, blood streaming from a serious wound in his leg. The injury looked bad, possibly a severed artery that would be fatal without immediate medical attention. "Go," Morrison shouted at Sarah. "Get the hostages to safety." But Sarah faced an impossible choice. Her mission was to protect the Americans they had rescued. But she couldn't abandon a wounded teammate. Danny was losing blood fast, and without help, he would die within minutes. The other team members were too busy fighting to provide medical aid. Making a split-second decision that would define her career, Sarah positioned the hostages behind cover and rushed back to Danny's position. Bullets whizzed around her as she slid behind the stone column where he had taken shelter. His face was pale with shock, and blood was pooling beneath his leg at an alarming rate. "I'm not leaving you," Sarah told him firmly as she applied pressure to the wound. She had brought extra medical supplies for the hostages, and now she used her training to save her teammate's life. Working by feel in the darkness, she located the source of bleeding and applied a tourniquet to stop the hemorrhaging. The machine gun had found their range and was methodically destroying their cover with sustained bursts of fire. Stone fragments showered down on them as the ancient monastery walls crumbled under the assault. Sarah knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before their position became completely untenable. Tom's sniper rifle cracked from the distant ridge, and suddenly the machine gun fell silent. Through her radio earpiece, Sarah heard his calm voice. "Machine gun neutralized. You have a window, but more hostiles approaching from the east." With Danny temporarily stabilized, Sarah faced her next challenge, getting a wounded man and 3 civilians over a 12-foot wall while under fire from multiple directions. It seemed impossible. But giving up wasn't an option. These people were counting on her, and she refused to let them down. "Can you climb?" she asked Danny, knowing the answer but hoping his determination would overcome his injury. "Not with this leg," he admitted through gritted teeth, "but I can cover you while you get the others out." Sarah looked at the blood-soaked bandage around his thigh and shook her head. "We all go home together. That's not negotiable." She called Morrison on the radio and quickly explained the situation. The team leader's response was immediate. They would hold their position and fight until everyone could be evacuated together. It was exactly what Sarah expected from a leader who truly understood the meaning of leaving no one behind. The next few minutes turned into the longest firefight of Sarah's career. With Danny providing what covering fire he could manage while lying prone, she helped each hostage over the wall one by one. Dr. Hayes went first, her medical training allowing her to understand the urgency of the situation despite her own injuries. As Sarah boosted Robert Kim over the wall, a new group of terrorists emerged from the main building. These weren't the disorganized guards they had been fighting. They moved with military precision and carried more sophisticated weapons. The leader barked orders in a foreign language, organizing his men for a coordinated assault. "We've got bigger problems," Mike's voice crackled over the radio. "These guys know what they're doing." Sarah could see what he meant. The new arrivals were setting up overlapping fields of fire and moving to surround their position. They weren't just trying to kill the intruders. They were executing a textbook military operation designed to capture prisoners. The thought of being taken alive by these terrorists was more terrifying than the prospect of death. With David Turner, the last hostage, halfway over the wall, Sarah heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The terrorists had brought heavy weapons and were preparing to destroy the entire area rather than risk losing their prisoners. She had perhaps 10 seconds before high explosive shells turned their position into a crater. "Incoming!" she shouted, pushing Turner over the wall and diving to cover Danny with her own body. The world exploded around them as mortar shells detonated against the ancient stone walls. The blast wave picked Sarah up and slammed her against the ground, leaving her ears ringing and her vision blurred. When the dust settled, Sarah found herself lying in a pile of rubble with Danny unconscious beside her. Blood ran down her face from multiple cuts, and her left shoulder felt like it was on fire. But she was alive, and more importantly, Danny was still breathing despite his injuries. The mortar attack had actually worked in their favor by destroying part of the wall and creating a gap they could use for escape. Sarah grabbed Danny under the arms and began dragging him toward the breach, ignoring the pain in her shoulder and the weight of his unconscious body. Morrison appeared through the smoke and dust, his uniform torn and his face blackened but his eyes still sharp and focused. "Can you move?" he asked Sarah, quickly assessing her condition. "I'm fine," she replied, though they both knew she wasn't. "Help me get Danny through the wall." "Help me get Danny through the wall." Together, they lifted the wounded SEAL and passed him through the gap to Mike, who was waiting on the other side with the rescued hostages. Sarah followed, squeezing through the narrow opening just as automatic weapons fire erupted behind them. The terrorists had regrouped and were mounting a final assault. On the other side of the wall, Tom had established an overwatch position and was systematically engaging enemy targets as they appeared. His precision shooting was buying them precious time to reach the extraction point, but ammunition was running low and reinforcements were still arriving. The extraction zone was half a mile away through rough terrain that would be difficult to navigate with wounded personnel and exhausted civilians. Sarah looked at Danny, who had regained consciousness but was clearly in serious pain, and at Dr. Hayes, whose arm was worse than she had initially admitted. Getting everyone to safety would require every ounce of strength and determination they possessed. As if reading her thoughts, Commander Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder. "Outstanding work in there, Martinez. You saved Danny's life and completed the mission. Your father would be proud." Sarah nodded, but she knew the mission wasn't over yet. They still had to reach the helicopters and get everyone home safely. The hardest part might still be ahead of them, but she was ready for whatever challenges remained. She had proven to herself and her team that she belonged among the elite warriors of naval special warfare. The half-mile journey to the extraction zone became a running battle through hostile territory. Sarah found herself essentially carrying Danny, whose leg wound had reopened during their escape from the compound. Dr. Hayes, despite her own injuries, helped support him from the other side, her medical training proving invaluable in keeping him conscious and stable. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. The terrorists had organized a massive search effort, with vehicle-mounted spotlights sweeping the landscape and radio chatter indicating they were coordinating with other cells in the area. What had begun as a surgical rescue operation was rapidly becoming a full-scale combat engagement. Tom's voice crackled over the radio with updates on enemy movements. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like they're trying to cut off your route to the LZ. I'm down to my last magazine up here. Commander Morrison made the decision to alter their course, leading the group through a rocky ravine that would provide concealment but add 15 minutes to their journey. Time was running out. Their extraction helicopters were already en route and couldn't wait indefinitely in such dangerous airspace. As they picked their way through the treacherous terrain, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since joining the Navy. 6 months ago, she had been an untested graduate facing skepticism from her new teammates. Now she was helping lead a life-or-death mission in one of the world's most dangerous regions, trusted with the lives of both military personnel and innocent civilians. The ravine opened into a flat area where they would be exposed to observation from the surrounding hills. Morrison called a halt and studied the terrain ahead through his night vision scope. Sarah used the break to check on Danny's condition and redistribute weight among their remaining supplies to make movement easier for the injured. Movement to the east, Morrison whispered. Looks like a patrol trying to flank us. Sarah peered through her own scope and spotted the threat. 4 armed men moving tactically through the brush about 300 meters away. They were clearly experienced fighters, not the poorly trained guards they had encountered at the compound. These were probably foreign military advisors or veteran mercenaries. The patrol was positioned between them and the extraction zone, making a direct approach impossible. Morrison signaled for the team to take defensive positions while he considered their options. They could try to circumvent the enemy patrol, but that would take too long and Danny needed immediate medical attention that only the helicopters could provide. Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "Give me 5 minutes," she told Morrison quietly. "I can take them." Morrison looked at her with concern. "That's 4 trained fighters, Martinez. The odds aren't good for a solo assault." "The odds aren't good for any of us if we don't reach that LZ," Sarah replied. "My size gives me an advantage in this terrain. I can get close without being detected." After a moment's consideration, Morrison nodded. "Take Mike with you for backup, but if this goes sideways, you break contact immediately." "We can't afford to lose anyone else." Sarah shook her head. "Mike needs to stay with Danny. This is something I can handle alone." Before Morrison could object further, Sarah was moving. She slipped away from the group like a shadow, using the rocky terrain to mask her approach toward the enemy patrol. Her small frame allowed her to move through spaces that would have been impossible for her larger teammates. The 4-man patrol had established an observation post overlooking the area where her team was hiding. They were using sophisticated equipment, including thermal imaging, which explained how they had tracked the Americans through the darkness. Sarah realized that a frontal assault would be suicide. She needed to use stealth and surprise to even the odds. Moving with infinite patience, she circled around to approach the patrol from behind. The rocky terrain provided numerous hiding spots, but each movement had to be perfectly timed to avoid detection by their sensors. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she closed within 50 meters of the enemy position. The patrol leader was speaking quietly into a radio, probably coordinating with other search teams. Sarah could hear fragments of conversation in a language she didn't recognize, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. They knew Americans were in the area and were systematically tightening the noose. From her concealed position, Sarah could see that the patrol had positioned themselves in a natural depression with excellent fields of observation but poor defensive positions. They were confident in their technological advantage and hadn't expected to be stalked by their intended prey. It was exactly the kind of overconfidence that SEAL training had taught her to exploit. She waited until 2 of the men moved away from the main position to check a possible movement they had detected on their screens. With only 2 enemies remaining at the observation post, Sarah's chances improved dramatically. She drew her knife and began the final approach. The first target never knew what hit him. Sarah struck from behind with surgical precision, neutralizing the threat silently before he could raise an alarm. The second man turned just as she reached him, his mouth opening to shout a warning that never came. Within 30 seconds, the observation post was secure. But Sarah's troubles were just beginning. The 2 patrol members who had moved away were returning, and they would discover their dead comrades within minutes. She had perhaps 60 seconds to prepare for their arrival, using the element of surprise and superior positioning to defeat 2 experienced fighters. When the remaining enemies returned and found their teammates dead, Sarah was ready. She had positioned herself behind their own equipment, using their thermal imaging system to track their movements in the darkness. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was using their technological advantage against them. The brief firefight that followed demonstrated everything Sarah had learned about close-quarters combat. She engaged both targets simultaneously, using the terrain and darkness to her advantage. When the shooting stopped, all 4 members of the enemy patrol were eliminated, and Sarah had cleared the path to the extraction zone. "Threats neutralized," she reported calmly over the radio. "LZ is clear." Morrison's response carried a note of amazement that he didn't try to hide. "Outstanding work, Martinez. You just saved all our lives." The helicopter extraction went smoothly, with both civilians and wounded personnel receiving immediate medical attention during the flight to safety. Danny would eventually make a full recovery, though he would carry scars from the mission for the rest of his life. Dr. Hayes and the other hostages were reunited with their families within days. Back at base, the mission was deemed a complete success. All hostages had been rescued alive. No American personnel were killed, and valuable intelligence was gathered about terrorist operations in the region. Sarah received a commendation for her actions during the extraction, specifically noting her decision to eliminate the enemy patrol single-handedly. More importantly to Sarah, she had finally earned the complete respect and trust of her teammates. The doubts and hesitation that had marked her early days with SEAL Team 4 were gone, replaced by the absolute confidence that comes from proven performance under fire. She was no longer the untested female trying to fit into a male-dominated world. She was simply a SEAL who happened to be a woman. 6 months later, when new recruits joined the team and expressed surprise at having a female teammate, the veterans would tell them with complete sincerity, "You forgot what she can do. Don't underestimate Martinez. She's the one who saved our lives when everyone else said it was impossible." Sarah had proven that courage, skill, and determination knew no gender. She had broken barriers not through speeches or politics, but through action under fire when lives hung in the balance. The little girl from Texas who had climbed trees and wrestled with boys had grown into a warrior worthy of the most elite fighting force in the world.